Hey everyone, welcome to our first look Armoured Warfare video. We're going to be quickly showcasing the brand new tanks coming in patch 0.21, and those are the Tier 6 BVP 1 AFV, Tier 7 Kto Rosomak AFV, Tier 8 Roseau Mech M1 AFV, Tier 9 Anders Light Tank, and the Tier 10 Wilk XC8 Tank Destroyer. With 0.21 just around the corner, we were lucky enough to be given access to the test server and get our hands onto these new vehicles and test them out early. Plus get some footage to be able to show you guys a bit about how these weapons perform and a bit of what they're about. Now the first of these vehicles you're likely to get access to is going to be the BVP M2. Now the M2 began life as a Slovakian BVP2. It was trialled by the Czech military and a whole bunch of trials. Never really went anywhere because of the small caliber of the gun. It was only 30mm, plus a whole host of other issues including the lack of protection against things like mines. The problem was the fact that it was just based off the BVP2 hull. It was just simply at its limits. So putting the larger cannon, the 40mm or more armor, was just not an option. The vehicle was just too heavy for its suspension already. The M2 never actually ended up being purchased by the Czech military, or, well, anybody in fact, although the manufacturer, oddly enough, does still offer it as an option even to this day, although I doubt that's probably going to go anywhere for them. In terms of armoured warfare though, it's a tier 6 armoured fighting vehicle. The 30mm Roy cannon actually is pretty decent. You can pretty easily tear lighter vehicles to shreds or even hit weak spots on heavier armoured vehicles. You can actually see me tearing tanks to shreds in the footage in the background. You can see me putting accurate and penetrating shots into the side of a Stingray 2, which, while it's not the heaviest armoured thing in the world, it's something that some autocannons struggle with a little bit on the side. But the AC on the BVP doesn't have any problems with that at all. It's a solid little thing without being particularly outstanding. It's not going to deal with main battle tanks from the front though, and that's where the twin Atgm launcher comes into play. The thing about these Atgms is that you can either fire them as fire and forget, so basically you right click on a vehicle and fire. At that point the missile guides itself into the centre mass of the vehicle automatically. It's not going to adjust for weak spots or terrain. Now that allows you to pop out of cover, quickly fire the missile and pop back into cover again. Or you can just manually guide the missile in just like any other ATGM. This versatility allows you to pick your fights more effectively. A lot of ATGM vehicles have issues where you don't necessarily want to be exposed for too long and then you take return fire. But the BVP M2, if you see something you think you can hit with the fire and forget, then you can do exactly like that, and it gives this a decent advantage in peaking games over other vehicles. The vehicle honestly reminds me a lot of the Tier 8 Bradley in the way it plays, except that I find the autocannon to be more effective than the Bradley's is for its tier. I've found it to be a very neat little vehicle, and one I've had a decent amount of fun in. The autocannon, I mean, it isn't terrible. 80mm of penetration with armor piercing, 301 rounds per minute. It's got a really nasty damage output if you get into a position where you can land all those shots. The low penetration though means it's not going to push anywhere near the kind of damage, the max damage it can potentially do because of the penetration, but it definitely holds its own. It's got the same view range as the Fox as well, meaning that it's going to be a pretty effective little scout, although just be aware that the BVP is pretty huge and isn't going to be, well, let's be honest, it's going to be much harder to hide than the little Foxes, although with the height it does come with a little bit of armour. It's not a lot, but it's enough to deter other autocannons at its tier and lower, especially with the sloping at the front of the vehicle, plus the upgrades to the armour. It can be pretty bouncy when it comes to lower tier autocannons, and can actually even bounce other BVP autocannon rounds. It's not that well armoured, but it is enough that going toe to toe with other lighter vehicles, you might be able to bounce a few rounds with some decent angling. All in all though, from my time in it, I thought it was a decent little machine. It's able to scout with a potent punch if it gets a chance at something lightly armoured, or with the ability to snapshot its missiles. Definitely worth checking out if you like your light vehicles. Just remember, it is not quick. It's no Fox when it comes to manoeuvrability, so you are going to have to remember a bit of a different playstyle is needed. Now the second vehicle you're going to come across is the Tier 7 Kto Rosomak, also another armoured fighting vehicle. This vehicle is currently in service with the Polish military as its primary infantry fighting vehicle. The Polish military were looking for a new vehicle to replace their already out of service IFV vehicles, the OT-64. They turned to the Finnish for their XC-360 AFV, with the idea of modifying it to meet the requirements of their military for both an infantry fighting vehicle as well as an armoured personnel carrier. They tried out a couple of different versions with the 25mm cannon on, and eventually settled on the American-made 30mm Bushmaster. The vehicle's seen service, with about 100 of them being used in the war in Afghanistan. In armoured warfare though, much like the BVP that comes before it, the autocannon is the star of the show. But it's more than just the star, it's the only act in that show. That's right, the Roseau Mech comes with no missiles whatsoever. This is the first new vehicle to have come out since Tanks Reloaded that only has an autocannon, and shows that the idea of the AFVs needing to have missiles, and that's not something that's going to be in the future of armoured warfare. You're going to have vehicles that only have autocannons. But how did it perform once I got my hands on it? Well, you know what, it's actually a fairly solid autocannon, even if it's not particularly spectacular. Honestly though, this vehicle worries me slightly, and at the risk of sounding critical, I don't necessarily see how it's going to fit in. The problem with the Roseau Mech is that I don't know how it's going to hold up against its competitors. The autocannon had less penetration than the other AC vehicles in its tier, so while yes, it has a decent rate of fire, 200 rounds a minute, and a very high damage per minute of just over 9,000, the lower penetration means it's going to penetrate less shots, and that means you are effectively losing damage from that. Its lower view range also than the other AFVs in its tier means that it's going to need to get closer to the enemy to spot them, most of the time within spotting ranges and distances of other AFVs, and you're going to be close to that in the spotting range of a main battle tank. The Roseau Mech is clearly designed to be a close range brawler with good hit points. It's got around 300 more than the BMP and just under 100 more than the Warrior, but the thing is that the extra hit points come at a cost, and that is the view range invisibility. Unlike the low to the ground BMD, the Roseau Mech is huge, probably around the same size as the Warrior, but it's not as heavily armoured as the Warrior, hurting its close range brawling capabilities. It's got 30mm less view range than the BMD and 20 less than the Warrior. The Roseau Mech didn't perform too badly when I got my hands on it. The autocannon felt solid enough to be able to put its damage out effectively, but I just didn't feel it was anything that special, or anything that is better than we've already got in the game. I don't know why I would take this over the BMD or the Warrior, especially if the autocannons on those are more effective than on the vehicle that is autocannon only. I spent the entire time thinking that this was missing its missiles, that it was something unfinished, until I found out it wasn't supposed to have missiles. I don't know about this one. I think time is going to tell on how effective this experiment is going to be. Our brand new tier 8 is the Kto Rosomak M1. Like the previous two vehicles, also an armoured fighting vehicle. The original Roseau Mech underwent a whole bunch of upgrades to become the M1. Most notably the addition of some extra electrical systems like fire detection systems, internal and external communications, plus it's got cameras to show the sides of the vehicle to give close-in protection. It was further upgraded from there to include the anti-RPG net, and that does come as an upgrade in Armoured Warfare, plus an anti-IED system and a Blue Force tracker. The M1M did go through some trials of a brand new 30mm turret which was unmanned, but that didn't get past the prototype stage and is not offered as an option on the vehicle in the game. So what is it like in the game? Well, the biggest thing to note is that it does have missiles. That's right, we're back to vehicles with missiles again. It's also got the same missile mechanics as the BVP with those auto-guiding missiles. With the auto-guiding missiles when you right-click a target, and then the manually guided ones when you're not locked onto something. This gives you a huge advantage in peeking games with lightly armoured targets, poke out, lock on, fire, pull back, minimum exposure to enemy fire. It's a good feature, and then obviously it's armed with another 30mm autocannon. This autocannon though is actually the best one at its tier. Decent penetration, once again huge damage per minute as well, so it's going to pen vehicles more reliably, and can actually even pen the lower front plates of some main battle tanks, and that gives it some decent firepower, especially if you can put those 200 rounds a minute to good work. Like its predecessors though, it does come with a lower view range than either of the other AFVs at its tier as well. 410 compared to the 450 of the Bradley, and even the 430 of the Ramka. Once again, it seems to be a closer range target, almost like a brawler again, yet it doesn't have the armour to do so. Only 115mm at the front means it's going to get torn to shreds by autocannons of its own tier. unlike the Ramka with its 227mm of armour at the front, which in my opinion is a true brawler. Like the Roseau Mech before, the Roseau Mech M1 didn't perform too badly when I got my hands on it, but I got the feeling I could have been better off in the other AFVs in its tier. I did like the autocannon though, I will say that, the gun feels solid, and the new missile mechanic is interesting and pretty useful, and I can see that being used in pop-out fights in PvP, like popping out of cover, firing, popping back in again, trying to minimise return fire. But I don't think it's going to be a bad vehicle at all. I just wonder how much it's going to be used over the others in its tier. Only time will tell on that one, but like I say, I don't think it's a bad one at all. The next vehicle coming with point 21 is the Tier 9 WPB Anders light tank. Like the PvP program, the Anders came from the need to upgrade from the aging Soviet era vehicles with something a bit more modern. The idea was to make the Polish mechanized into a highly mobile force, hence the reason for the mobility of the Roseau Mech armoured fighting vehicles, and ultimately led to the reason for the original prototype that it just wasn't well received. The lack of gun stabilisation meant that firing on the move just wasn't really a thing, it was very ineffective, so for a force designed to be mobile, that just would not do. The actual fate of the Anders isn't really known. There are some reports it was cancelled due to them realising the light vehicles like the Anders just isn't going to replace a main battle tank, and actually, to be honest, just got replaced by the Polish military buying a whole bunch of Leopard 2s. In game though, you got an option for a light tank other than the M8 Thunderbolt 2 finally, the only other tier 9 light tank. It comes with a pretty beefy 120mm gun with 700mm of penetration with heat rounds, which quite frankly is pretty damn good. It's a very punchy gun, and with 600 damage per shot with that heat, it's got decent damage output as well, especially since the gun, while it's not that fast to aim, is accurate enough to hit weak spots reliably. Other than the gun, which is fantastic, it stands up really well and straight up beats the M8 in a whole bunch of stats. Faster acceleration despite lower top speed means that it's pretty good for peaking games, although it does hurt its manoeuvrability in open areas. But unlike the M8, the armour of the Anders is not only sloped in a pretty decent way, but is also 250mm thick, compared to the M8 with only 120. This means that while the M8 does come with a whole bunch of ERA all over the vehicle, whereas the Anders doesn't, the Anders has the ability to bounce shots, is almost impervious to a lot of autocannons unless they're aimed at weak spots. In addition to that extra armour, the Anders has nearly 500 more hit points than the M8 does, so it's got extra armour and extra HP at the cost of having no ERA. The Anders was the first tank that I got my hands on the test server, and I tell you what, it's the most fun I've had in a light tank in a long time. It's not the fastest tank ever, but it was quick enough for me to still get my flank on, put that fantastic gun to work. I have a feeling the Anders is going to get a lot of love at tier 9. I know that I'm definitely going to be playing it for sure. I like this thing a lot, and I'm not normally one for playing light tanks, but this might just tip me into playing them a bit more often. The final vehicle we're going to look at though is the tier 10 Wilk XC8 tank destroyer. The XC8 is pretty much a KTO Roseau Mech with the autocannon removed and a 120mm gun added to it instead. Taken from the same idea as the Striker, main battle tank firepower on a lighter, more manoeuvrable platform, the XC8 would fit right into the Polish military's idea of a more manoeuvrable armoured force. The prototype was shown to the Polish Armed Forces in 2012, didn't really get any traction with them, mostly because of the 105mm gun that was on the vehicle. As such, it went back to be fitted with a 120mm gun, has been shown off at a few shows, plus to the Polish military. However, once again, the future of the Wilk isn't really known at this point. In the game, however, it's a really rather capable tier 10 tank destroyer. It's a very different one to a lot of the other tank destroyers. Firstly, it does not come with a ready rack at all, so it's not got the clip style firing mechanic the other TDs have up to this point. Instead, you get a really rapidly firing gun with 800 penetration with heat and 700 damage. Although during matches played with this thing, it wasn't uncommon to see numbers between 1000 and 1200 damage per shot, and with a 5-second reload time it can keep up with those other vehicles, and even put more damage downrange than the same tier vehicles. Its decently fast aim time and fantastic accuracy means you can keep up your fire and not only put a lot of shots down range, but land those shots accurately as well. This is a tank destroyer really designed to be sitting at the back behind your lines of defense, sniping at targets and putting a lot of accurate fire down. 75mm of armor really isn't going to do you anything at this tier against anything, so you aren't going to be wanting to put your vehicle in harm's way. But despite its large size, it's got fairly okay camo, so you should be able to keep this thing relatively hidden while putting your shots out there. I know a lot's been said on the forums about this thing, about the lack of ready rack, but I think that sometimes the advantage of a single high alpha hit compared to the ready rack is forgotten. In PvE, potentially the ready rack could pump out more damage more quickly than the Wilk. However, in PvP, where it's unlikely tanks are going to stick around for an entire clip from a TD, smashing a single high damage shot into them before they pull back is extremely useful. I quite like the Wilk, and it's what I consider to be the first proper tier 10 tank destroyer. It's going to surprise some people as to how useful it is, I think, but I guess that remains to be seen. So I hope you enjoyed my look at the new vehicles coming in Update 21. I'll have a more detailed review of them when it finally does launch, which hopefully will be very soon. I am looking forward to the new ammo changes coming in this patch too. Definitely felt like it's going to shake up the meta slightly from the testing on the test server, so look out for that. But for now, many thanks for watching, and I shall see you in the next video.